Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon. I think many of you have been to previous seminars. I recognize some names, but this is the Water as Heritage 2 seminar. My name is Simone Edgar Holmes. I'll be chairing this session. And this is one of 4 Water as Heritage sessions. The final 2 are taking place this Friday, if you'd like to join again then. I want to extend a huge thank you to Sam and Julia for not only being here to support, but for arranging this entire seminar and the wonderful people that they've brought along to speak with us. So we have 3 groups of presentations in this session, although I believe we've missing the first one. So we're going to skip ahead and begin with the group presentation on Waterborne, the Heritage, Culture and Environment of UK Reservoirs. Each of these presentations are going to vary slightly in length, but they'll be fairly short, and we're going to save all questions until the end. At that point, we can use the hand signal for questions, or you can type your question in the chat if preferred, and we'll read them out. So our first presentation comes from a team of 3 PhD candidates working on a project titled Waterborne, the Heritage, Culture and Environment of UK Reservoirs. This is a Northwest Consortium doctoral training partnership funded project that explores the design, literary history, and heritage of reservoir building in the UK. Our first presentation is a pre-recorded video from Kovacevic, who is unfortunately unable to join us. But he's a PhD student at Lancaster University who is conducting research on the architectural history of reservoirs in the UK. He has previously been involved in conservation projects, and his master's thesis involved studying a vernacular landscape that combined archival research and site documentation. He's currently analyzing the spatial implications of reservoir building, as well as the cultural history of water supply in Britain. Our second speaker in that series is Josephine Sweeney, who's a PhD student at the School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool in partnership with the Museum of English Rural Life. She also works in museums and heritage learning and engagement, and her PhD project explores how landscapes of post-war reservoirs are produced and perceived. Critical features of her work include the contested heritage of the recent past and landscapes of infrastructure and industry. And then finally, we have Supriya Kaur Dhaliwal, who is a writer and literary translator born in Palampur, India. She studied at the universities of Shimla, Dublin, and Belfast before joining Manchester Metropolitan University's Centre for Place Writing for her place-based creative writing PhD. Her research brings together hybrid narratives and critical inquiry to examine the interplay between ecological anxieties and water infrastructure, particularly focusing on fluid identities and the symbolism of water in placemaking. Supriya was the 2021 Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow at the University of Kent and is the author of The Yak Dilemma, published by Makina Books. Her research and creative work often intersect in exploring the fluid geographies of home. So now that I've introduced all these speakers, we'll begin. Sam, I believe, has a video set up with Aris's presentation. We can give him an honorary round of applause.
So I'm going to try streaming this video from my machine. If we find that the quality is very bad, then we also have a direct link that we can share with people to watch it instead. So if this is coming through really jerky, let me know.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aris, and I'm a researcher at Lancaster University, conducting a PhD project on the architectural history of reservoirs in the UK. And the project is part of an interdisciplinary teamwork with colleagues at the University of Liverpool and Manchester Metropolitan, who are dealing with other aspects of reservoir spaces, including the landscape and community history, as well as the creative responses to reservoir environments. My own project looks at reservoirs as a spatial typology that emerged in the late 18th century as a result of the sort of the mass consumption of resources, including water in the early industrial period, and seeks to define reservoirs as a reflection of changing attitudes to the environment, but also of the social and economic realities in the UK in the period between the late 18th and the late 20th century. The project is analyzing not just the spatial resultants of the introduction of reservoirs into the urban and rural areas, but also looks at the main drivers behind the reservoir initiatives. And although cities have been the main drivers of reservoir development in the industrial and modern periods, I'm also looking at how other spatial typologies such as the canal networks and water mills have also given rise to some of the earliest examples of reservoirs in the early.
Apologies. There we go. And then maybe I can.
The control bar is not the worst. It's just that there's a preview of what you're sharing that's sort of in the middle of the slide as well.
Okay, yeah, I can get rid of that.
Yeah.
I think.
There we go. So then you can put the bar up at the top.
Then the bar can go back where it was. Yes, apologies for that.
In the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Research is looking at the environmental consequences of reservoir construction, but also at the types of debates that have been brought about by the introduction of this type of industrial infrastructure into mainly rural areas, and by looking at case studies such as the conversion of some of the lakes into reservoirs in Lake District in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. The research is shedding light on some of the earliest environmental movements in the UK, but also to the foundation of organizations such as the National Trust in 1895. As part of a collaboration with Historic England, I'm analyzing reservoirs as heritage assets, and I'm looking at the existing cultural designation in place for reservoir structures and sites, and I'll be defining the architectural and other types of heritage value as part of a future recommendation for the designation of reservoir sites, and I'm also looking at the policies for natural landscapes and how these correlate with those of reservoirs. Minimizing reservoir sites in terms of not just their position within the environment, but also as part of the wider cultural landscape of reservoir systems in a way that defines reservoir sites as co-designed with other infrastructural elements, including transport routes, but also as reservoir sites sitting within a system that extends via aqueduct lines that service reservoirs and other ancillary infrastructure in the urban environments. And by looking at the spatial resultants of the introduction of reservoirs across the environment, the project is also defining what sort of non-spatial change has also been brought about by the presence of reservoir infrastructure, including the right to access to landscape, the ownership, and as well as the changing land use patterns within the areas that have been affected by reservoir construction. And I will now be giving floor to my colleagues for further discussions on the topic. And thanks very much for your attention.
Apologies for my boomer sharing of the chat feature, which managed to be unstoppable for a while. But I hope that came through well enough for everyone.
Thank you for helping with the tech side of things for that. We'll pass it on to Joe now for the next presentation in this team project.
Hi, and yeah, well done. I thought that was dealt with very, very smoothly. So yeah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully this is smooth. I do. this? Can everyone see okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yes.
So yes, as Addis has already introduced, I'm one of three interconnected PhDs. My name's Josephine Sweeney. And my PhD project is titled "The Landscape of Post-War Reservoirs: Environment, Conservation, and Perception." And so I came to this project from a background in heritage studies, and as Simone introduced, with an interest in the heritage of infrastructural and industrial landscapes, but really a pretty limited prior engagement with specifically post-war reservoirs. So what I'm going to share is a very brief overview of my PhD research to date, but yeah, just to emphasize that it's all quite early stages, and I would really welcome any kind of feedback and thoughts in the discussion. So what about the landscape of post-war reservoirs am I interested in? Yeah, as Addis has kind of laid out a bit already, the period following the Second World War, there was kind of significant environmental and infrastructural planning in the UK, and it underwent kind of manifold changes, and these changes continue to shape the landscape that we inhabit and rely upon today. So it's been over 30 years since any new potable water reservoirs have been constructed in the UK. That is until last year when construction began on one, and there's now 9 other new reservoirs kind of proposed across England. But yeah, this lack of construction is not to say that the landscape and perceptions of the landscape of reservoirs haven't changed. And I've included this image from a film by Andrew Black, which shows an old wall which had previously been submerged by the filling of Thrushcross Reservoir, which is also a post-war reservoir. And it's this wall that's been exposed by the kind of lowering water levels during the 2022 heat wave. So I've included it to kind of illustrate the way in which perceptions of landscape are constantly being renegotiated in the present, and particularly in light of these kind of prospections of water scarce futures. Next slide. So yeah, fundamentally, my research asks how the landscape of post-war reservoirs is produced and perceived. And what I'm particularly interested in is how these landscapes embody the political, social, and ecological circumstances of their production, the way in which they're interwoven with sort of very divergent local, regional, national identity and interests, and also how these infrastructural landscapes both shape and are shaped by notions of rural landscape. So that's kind of the key points that I'm interested in unpacking. So yeah, I'm now very briefly going to discuss a pilot case study that I undertook to kind of ground this all in a specific landscape. So in 1962, the City of Birmingham Water Department commissioned landscape architect Brenda Colvin to work on Trimpley Reservoir in Worcestershire, which is the first example of a landscape architect being commissioned and involved in this way. So the reservoir supplements water from the Elan Valley reservoirs in Wales, which were constructed at the end of the 19th century, and also supply water to Birmingham. It's a non-impounding reservoir, so it's not relying on blocking a river or a stream. Rather, it's filled by pumping water from the River Severn. And if you can see my mouse, you can kind of see here the river hugging the edge of the reservoir at the bottom. So yeah, I'm now just going to talk through a few of the key ideas that emerge from this pilot case study and the methods that underpin them. So one of the first things that arose in my research, almost as a precursor to this question about production and perception of the landscape of reservoirs is what is a landscape of reservoirs, or for that matter, what is the landscape of a specific reservoir. So Trimpley allowed me a case study to kind of think through this conundrum. And one of the ways I did that was through gathering various maps, which I would say allowed me to kind of complicate rather than clarify this question. And so, yeah, what might constitute the landscape of Trimpley Reservoir? Might it be the county of Worcestershire? But that then you drive 15 minutes north and you're in Shropshire. It abstracts its water from the River Severn, and so then I wondered, could you look to the river and its catchment basin as a defining area? But then that incorporates 21,000 kilometers squared and straddles both England and Wales. And then I started to think about, what about the infrastructural landscape? So would that then include the Elan Valley reservoirs, the Elan Valley Aqueduct that goes all the way to Frankley Reservoir, and the water treatment works just outside, well, in Birmingham. And then if you follow this even further, following the infrastructure, or rather the water, you could then argue that the landscape of Trimpley extends to the taps of Birmingham, and then even to the bodies that consume that water. So yeah, I think this exercise kind of makes clear the difficulty in trying to boundary any landscape, but particularly the difficulty of trying to boundary a kind of watery and infrastructural one. And then another key way in which I attempted to sort of comprehend the landscape of Trimpley was through walking. So when I was visiting, I tried to visit not just Trimpley, but also Chelmarsh Reservoir, which is just north of Trimpley, very, very close by, but on the other side of the Severn. And this picture here on the left shows Hampton Lode Pipe Bridge, which crosses the River Severn and connects Chelmarsh Reservoir to Hampton Lode Treatment Works, which as of May this year, Trimpley also is connected to. And yeah, the bridge is primarily a pipe bridge, but it can be accessed by water company staff, but there's no public access. But then here on the right, you can see Google Maps suggested walking route, so which takes you first of all through the water treatment works, which is also no public access, and then over this pipe bridge. So yeah, this kind of practice of walking as method really helps to highlight this friction between the mapped and the embodied experience of landscape, and it's also points to the kind of friction within the infrastructural landscape, so between the movement of people and the movement of water. And yeah, my thinking about kind of walking as method is very much underpinned by an interest in phenomenological approaches to landscape, and not only the phenomenology of my own perceptions of landscape, but also I'm interested in the perceptions of the other actors that I encounter. So, you know, what is the angler or the dog walker's experience of perception of the landscape of Trimpley, and how are they different? And also, how do they reconcile or incorporate their routine use of the landscape with an understanding of its infrastructural purpose? And also, how do they reconcile it with their own sort of bodily wateriness, and also their kind of interdependency on the reservoir as a body of water? And then I just wanted to end with a final thought on a particularly kind of early stage idea, and that kind of arose from the field work, which was thinking about what ontologies arise when you engage with the non-human actors involved in the production of the landscape of reservoirs. So this slide shows two actors that I kind of encountered, one through conversation and one kind of more obviously with the sign at Trimpley. So yeah, one is the zebra mussel, which is considered an invasive species and is increasingly an issue for water companies. It clogs pipes and it reduces reservoir capacity. And then sludge. So Trimpley has a sludge lagoon, which holds the kind of impurities removed from the reservoir water, and then intermittently requires desludging. So as the capacity reduces, as it fills with sludge. So yeah, in thinking about these actors, it sort of provokes an engagement with this idea of making and unmaking of space. I'm interested in the way that these actors are both kind of part of the assemblage of actors that constitute the landscape, but they're also engaged in sort of reducing capacity or unmaking the space. And that sort of invited me to think about the way in which reservoirs as a whole are engaged in a kind of making and unmaking of space. So thinking about that image of Thrushcross Reservoir and the submerged space of the formerly inhabited land, or in the case of Trimpley, agricultural land, and also the unmaking of the reservoir levels through demand and drought. So yeah, on that provocation or a sort of very unresolved thought, I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Supriya. But yeah, thank you for your time, and to the organisers and fellow speakers and Simone for chairing.
I'll capture my clapping audio. Thank you so much, Jo. That was really fascinating. Our final presenter today is Andrew Williams. He is a history PhD student at the University of West Indies, Mona in Jamaica. He has a BA Honours in History and Politics from Lancaster University and has worked at the Victoria Gallery and Museum, University of Liverpool. His research is in Jamaica on early 18th century Kingston and was initially supported by a study abroad studentship from the Leverhulme Trust. He now receives a departmental award from the Department of History and Archaeology, and his presentation today is titled Jamaica's Venice, History and Geology in Newmarket, St. Elizabeth. Please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you very much, Simone, and thank you to the previous presenters too. Very thought-provoking stuff on reservoirs. So yeah, I'm talking today, I'm taking a very micro lens, or we say local history, would be the classic way to say it, on a small town in Jamaica and its relationship with water, in a sense. And I haven't put this in the presentation, but I will clarify that I didn't randomly stumble upon this town. My own thesis research is focusing on Kingston, but my interest in this town is actually where my wife grew up. So I became quite familiar with it and I became quite interested in it. And as a historian, very inquisitive, like how did this come to be and so on. So I kind of put this together and developed a project from that point. So, okay, so a little introduction, just so we know what we're working with here. So the question is that I've begun with is why examine the history of a small Jamaican town, or indeed this small Jamaican town? So Newmarket is the name of the town, and it's nearly unique in Jamaica, or basically unique in Jamaica, as a town that has suffered from recurrent flooding for about 200 years, as far as we know, and yet remains a populated and an active town where it's quite vibrant, certainly not noticeably decreased in population over the last 200 years, certainly increasing to an extent. Quite an interested and excited kind of market town with a lot of shops and stores. So in that regard, I kind of say that it's not unique in the world. Obviously, there are towns, there are cities, and there are villages around the world that do suffer from flooding on a relatively regular basis. I've just named two off the top of my head here. York, I know, obviously suffers from the local rivers overflowing, and the small kind of village of Planina in Slovenia, which also has this kind of recurrent flooding that occurs. And I'm sure there are many other examples. Newmarket also has quite a strong historical record. It's got nearby Christian missionary church set up by the Moravians, one of the earliest churches in Jamaica, in the inner parts of the island, that has its own records. And therefore you can learn quite a lot about the town going back to about 200 years from their perspective. And it also contributes, this kind of question contributes to village studies or local history or even urban history in the Caribbean, which itself is not a very deeply studied topic. So the kind of question I'm asking with this presentation is it possible to draw lessons from the recurrent flooding that Newmarket has suffered to kind of create a framework or an understanding for how communities that are affected by extreme flooding, how they express resilience and how they recover from disaster? And I do talk about this towards the end of the presentation in a bit more detail. And there's a picture on the side there. So that shows the Newmarket town centre, where the main shops are. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I will explain in this presentation. So I'm going to kind of see what we're working with here and talk a bit about the history of Newmarket so you understand why this town came to be where it is. So Newmarket, it began as a village. It's now considered a town on the main southern route between the two main urban centres of Jamaica, which is Kingston on one end of the island and Montego Bay on the other end of the island. So the main kind of passage you would take if you were going at least along the southern part of the island, you would pass through Newmarket on that very road you saw in the previous slide on that photo. It's located in the parish of St. Elizabeth. Jamaica organises its system on parishes rather than states or counties. And St. Elizabeth was described in the 18th century during the period of slavery as having few sugar plantations, but a great many pens. And pens were used for breeding livestock and so on. And often that would happen in an area of the country where it wasn't suitable for the heavy, intensive agriculture. And perhaps we will learn why in a moment. So the town or the village was established on the property boundary of 4 different estates called Painstown, New Savannah, Kep, and Mocko. And my best guess, and there's no real concrete understanding here, but my best guess is it was established around the 1850s and the 1860s, when, as I'll sort of explain on the next slide, it's sort of at the center of several small holding communities of formerly enslaved people or emancipated people who had become emancipated in 1834, had developed these small holding communities. They had small farms, provision farms or small produce farms, and they developed communities. And at the center of there, and at the property boundary of the 4 large estates, Newmarket was established. This photo on the right is from the National Library of Jamaica and shows the market in Newmarket around the year 1900. This is quite a typical scene. If you to look at market photos from anywhere in Jamaica, it would look similar to this. So as I say, enslaved people were emancipated in 1834, and then they had a period of apprenticeship that ended in 1838. But essentially, what happened at that point was there was a real burst or release of energy, they say, the historians who've looked at this topic. And as I say, I'm a bit of an earlier student of a bit of an early period. But they say there's basically a massive release of energy, and a lot of the formerly enslaved people, they went out and they set up towns, or they set up small holding communities, and some of these turned into villages, they turned into towns. And because of the end of slavery, you have the labor costs increase for the large white planter class. They start selling off parts of their estates, and they choose the first parts they sell are the least productive parts. And so you have sort of the estates around Newmarket selling off their least productive parts. Now, why were these the least productive parts? One of the earliest mentions of Newmarket is in response to an investigation into the Morant Bay Rebellion, which was a major sort of anti-colonial uprising in Jamaica that happened quite far away from Newmarket. But there had been sort of one unruly person in Newmarket had invoked the Morant Bay Rebellion, and then they investigated it, and so they called several Newmarket residents as witnesses to the commission and so on. And say someone mentioned Newmarket by name, and that's the earliest kind of mention I've seen in published works of Newmarket, down at the bottom of the slide. And then you see the old market that I saw on the last slide. That's it, sort of in the 1960s. So moving into, it didn't change a huge amount. And if you compare the 2 images, you see there are probably at least one of the buildings is the same. So here we situate on a map. This is a cadastral map of the area, so it gives you a little better impression of what I'm talking about from the 1870s. And you have Newmarket in the middle, village of Newmarket, and you have the large estates around in different colours. And by this time, they started selling off parts of the local area to formerly enslaved people to develop their own communities around, kind of situated around the village. So moving on to the kind of link that we have here to the topic of the Living with Water seminar series, which is the flooding, the recurrent, extreme, dramatic flooding that happened several times. I've managed to trace to 1842, 1870, 1899, 1933, and 1979. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those floods, what people kind of said about them at the time, what we know about them, their extent and so on, and the damage they caused. So as I said, near to Newmarket is a Moravian church, which is a missionary religious group founded in Germany that spread to Jamaica and also quite a lot of the Americas. And they were really focused in the area around Newmarket, and really close was the Church of New Carmel, which was finished in 1828. It's about a mile away from the town, on quite a big hill, which turned out to be fortuitous. Their records, we can get kind of a quite good understanding of Newmarket's history. The 1842 flood was the earliest that I know of, but obviously, because, as I will explore, these floods were caused by geological circumstances, it's very likely that these floods have been happening many more times before this. But the earliest one that I've been able to find record of was 1842, where the Moravian missionaries kept a diary, and they noted that the waters in the Painstown pastures, Painstown being one of the estates, were no less than 7 fathoms, which is 11 meters deep. One missionary on his way to the church on horseback ended up in a sinkhole, got wet up to his neck, so that kind of gives you an impression it was pretty deep water. And also another missionary, there's a record of him drowning in the waters, and presumably the consequences to the local population were quite significant and possibly caused other deaths. We don't have that information. The 1870 flood was kind of the next major flood, and that's what I'm focusing on. And that was described as worse, if anything, than the previous one. And that emerged from these persistent rains and took the form of a 3-mile-long lake from, stretching across the area. And the depth of the water was estimated quite a bit deeper, 15 to 18 meters, and they claim up to 45 meters in some places, which is possible, but and it's known that 2 men drowned in the lake during that time period. So normally this lake would last for months at a time, stretching across the whole sort of area. So moving on, you got the 1899 flood. And I don't have a huge amount about that, but I did find a newspaper article where I get the title for this presentation, where a newspaper journalist, presumably white, not a local resident, had visited, probably from Kingston, and described the area as Jamaican Venice, or which it's a great turn of phrase, but it does make you think about how these were being perceived, and it does introduce an angle to this kind of research that I need to explore a bit more, which is sort of how did these floods become tourist attractions and how did that manifest? But that is an important question to ask. That kind of aspect definitely disappeared over the years. But in this time period, around 1899, and as in 1933, it was probably considered a bit of a tourist attraction, a bit of a phenomenon worth seeing. So in 1933, there was another major flood. They described it as sufficiently deep to float a tourist liner. But the article that I read here did actually note that the economic consequences that these floods were having, because these were small farmers predominantly who had crops for sustenance and so on, selling at local markets, their entire livelihood would be basically wiped out for 6 months to a year at a time, any time one of these floods happened. Never mind, of course, the buildings that they lived in, which at this time were maybe more board houses, so perhaps somewhat easier to replace than a concrete house would be today, but nonetheless, quite devastating indeed. The final major flood was 1979, and that's the one that people in Jamaica would most associate. So if you say Newmarket, they'll probably say, okay, that's on the main road, I've been through there. And the second thing they'll think is 1979, there was a flood there, and it was, in the news, and it was quite a famous event in Jamaica at the time. And this was caused by Tropical Depression 1 of 1979. This is the best documented, of course, the most recent one, covered 700 acres, reached 28 meters at its deepest point. And this was also an interesting one because as the water began to reduce, it then started to go back up again. And so the floodwater persisted for around a year at the time, from crossing from 1979 to 1980. There, of course, have been, and also 8 people drowned on the lake in a boat accident in that flood. There have been subsequent floods. It hasn't stopped, except that none of the subsequent ones have really reached the scale of 1979, and so people don't really conceive of them as being the same kind of major floods. But particularly after the various hurricanes that could pass through Jamaica introduce a lot of rain often. After like Hurricane Ivan in 2004, it was quite a lot of flooding. I think there was a lot again in 2011. So there have been more recent floods, but they're not considered on the same level. Oh, and also, if you see the image at the bottom, that's just from 1979, and you just see the rising waters and how fast it was rising. This wasn't even 13th of July 1979 wasn't even the peak of the flooding. It got deeper than that. But as you can see, this was devastating for people who lived in the community. So I might get sacrificed for this slide by an actual geologist, but this is sort of my summary of why these things happen, and what are the geological causes of the flooding. And so there are kind of several factors that kind of come together and create these lakes, as they're often termed, the Newmarket Lake. First of all, Newmarket's situated in a valley. And as people know, of course, you get the runoff of water from the higher up areas. It's going to cause a lot more water pooling in the bottom of the valley. That's quite simple. It's also Jamaica, 2/3 of the landscape is what they call karst topography, which is limestone, which limestone is porous, so water will eventually seep through limestone, but also it's karst landscape is where the limestone has sort of dissolved to create a lot of sinkholes and caves, and then eventually underground rivers, and that's represented on the image on this slide. So you have the valley and you have the karst, and then of course at the bottom you have these underground rivers or aquifers, or kind of the bedrock that's holding groundwater. And so you have a perfect storm of sinkholes and so on getting potentially blocked. You've got long rainy season, so these aquifers start to fill up, and all it takes often in the case is sort of a few days of really heavy rains, and the water starts to come out and pool above the surface, and that's sort of how these lakes appear. And that's my summary. I do intend to kind of run this by some more qualified geologists and see what they think. But having read a few things, I've not really cited anything here, but having read a few of the works on Newmarket and broader kind of karst and stuff, this is sort of the summary I'm reaching as to the actual scientific cause of the flooding. So I have an image here of a bit of Newmarket. It's sort of the top part of Newmarket. It's not showing the main bit of the town, so it doesn't look very built up from here. This is sort of up on one hill, and you can definitely see the other hill on the other side. So you can definitely kind of get the idea of the valley going on here. That's the kind of effect I wanted to show with this image. But Newmarket is situated down in the middle. You don't see the main town from here, but you can see a few houses, and that's kind of one of the communities to the north of the town. So the consequences of the flooding, what are the consequences? I've talked a bit about some of that, but the negative consequences are obviously the destruction of farmed land, drowning of livestock, destruction of property, real estate, and of course, people dying on occasion. The positive consequences are probably a lot more limited, but you can say that there were economic opportunities that arose when these floods happened, particularly for people who were enterprising in operating rafts and boats to ferry people across, because of course this was a main route between two of the main urban centres. People still had to get across somehow. And so you do see that. I've got an example here, Lance Walker, who witnessed the 1933 and 1979 floods. He learned to build a raft, and he also was taught to use a gun, which is a bit ominous in the 1933 floods. But I assume potential looting or people not wanting to pay to use the rafts and things like that, and so that kind of situation arose. But the greatest consequence was after the 1979 flood, the most recent major flood, when the government actually built a new town, a new Newmarket, about 3 miles up the road, called Louisville, and attempted to relocate the citizens to this new Newmarket. which actually didn't really it worked. People live there, but it didn't really work. A lot of people don't live there. And that was one of the questions I've been trying to explore in this research is why do people still live in the bit of Newmarket, the old Newmarket, that is so susceptible to these floods? And so we've just got a couple of pictures here, drawing to the end of the presentation. This is one of the old board houses that the government originally constructed in the 1980s in the new Newmarket. And the image on the right is just one of the streets in this new Newmarket called Louisville. I got a little comment on the bottom there that I thought I would throw in, didn't really have anywhere else to put it. But there is a great irony because I know that in the United States there has a lot of karst landscapes. They use the groundwater as a source of water, potable water. And the irony is that Newmarket clearly has all this groundwater and all these aquifers, and yet there is no potable water supply in the town. They use rainwater catchment systems. And it's only this year that the government's actually initiated a project to try and rectify that, and we'll see how that goes. So finally, the project's future, and I've thrown a lot of information out there. I've not really thought much about the framework, but I did want to draw on an example I found in Lotte Jensen 2021 article talking about the Netherlands, a country that's had so many recurrent floodings over its history, and how this has shaped the Dutch national identity. And perhaps thinking about how do small places like Newmarket around the world have their own identity shaped by recurrent flooding? And that's kind of the question I'm thinking about. I've not provided an answer here. And I've got a few thoughts on how I would proceed with this project. Oral history is a big thing. I've conducted a couple of interviews with elder residents, but there's a big repository of oral history in Jamaica that I have not yet explored. And so that's one thing on my list. Images, photographs, of course, are fascinating to see. Any printed or written witness accounts I'm going to be searching out for. And an idea I've also had is to try and go around and make a map with a few locals of like the sinkholes, the caves that they know of, and try and chart that and perhaps compare that to the official kind of maps that exist of the geology of the region. And then the idea maybe I'd transform this into a research article down the line or something, possibly taking it from a local history or water history or possibly a disaster studies angle. I'm not entirely sure which one, but this is kind of a summary of the project. And I think, my references, and I think that is it. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was wonderful. At this point, we can open up the floor to any questions. I do have some if no one immediately has one, but you're welcome to